Testing, testing, testing. And we're back. And by back, I mean I am back. Or is me back? Follow along, because thou art the one who wilt follow me. So goes the title of this lesson, and I am going to start my reading of the lesson with two quotes. The first quote is from Lacan himself. He says, "The other is therefore the locus in which is constituted the I who is speaking with him who hears." Okay, we're going to say that again at another point in my lecture. And he starts his lesson with a quote from a French grammar book. And here it is. "I'm much more myself. Before I was a parame who thought of myself as the true one and who was absolutely false." Let's say that again after a sip of coffee. "I'm much more myself. Before I was a parame who thought of myself as the true one and who was absolutely false." So the question I ask, which is Lacan's question, is how do we get from the principal clause in this sentence, "I was a parame who thought of myself as the true one," to the relative clause, "and who was absolutely false." Or, "I was a parame," principal clause, "who thought of myself as the true one," and who was absolutely false. I think those are two relative clauses here. The answer hinges on this personal pronoun, who. How do we get from the principal clause in this sentence to the relative clause? What passes through the corridor of this relative pronoun, who? And this is equivalent to the question of how does one metaphorize oneself? We've been working within the ambit bookended by metaphor and metonymy, their difference, their mutual warped and wefted relationship with one another. And we're going to try to make some headway in this recording. How is it that we can alchemically transform an I into a one? What's lost in this transformation? And can we even say that the transformation, the identification, the attempt to bring it about is even successful? This change in form from an I to a one, we could think of as reamassing the weight of myself as an I within the locus of an other, capital O. The universal one, as in one does, one eats, one washes, one acts, one sings, one paints, one sleeps. This universal one is obtained as an extract produced by an alternation of places, of values between I and you. We could think of this as a two-man game of musical chairs with one chair left. And the game is never played without evidencing a loser and a winner. Only it's never quite clear who's won or who's lost. Resonances of the Kojevian rendering of Hegel's master-slave dialectic here. Who, in a sense, is a byproduct of this game that I'm describing. This relative pronoun, who. To reach the other side of this who is a kind of symbolic victory, but it doesn't come about without a major cost. That is, you guessed it, the price of entry, castration. There is never a true reciprocity between I and you. The relationship is not one of beings recognized in their capital B being, the being which they share with one another. It's a question of enunciation. The you which comes about in the enunciation bisects the speaker into an I, which is irreconcilable with the enunciation itself, and then the place of the enunciation. And later we're going to take a look at schema L, and we can kind of map the place of the enunciation onto it along with the irreconcilability that I'm describing, which of course in schema L crystallizes a certain provisional equilibrium, which in neurosis involves repression. I am not going to give the obligatory warning about my French pronunciation. I'm going off of what I heard Google Translate tell me to say. So if there are any French listeners, I have my doubts that there are, who have a problem with my pronunciation and how I'm butchering your language, well, I've just been to the butchers. Sal. Tu es celui qui me suivra partout. Tu es celui qui me suivra partout. Thou art the one who wilt, Chamberlain, follow me. Okay? Tu es celui qui me suivra partout. Thou art the one who will follow me everywhere. Tu es celui qui tu es celui qui me suivra partout. Thou art the one who will follow me everywhere. Both of these sentences are said, pronounced in the exact same way, but they are written differently. In the first sentence I read, suivra ends with an S. In the second sentence, suivra loses that S. With the S, we are connoting something very different than the meaning contained in the sentence that has suivra without the S. Okay, in the footnote, which I'll read to you, says the first of these two sentences, that is, with the S, has a subordinate verb in the second person singular. And in the second of these two sentences, the subordinate verb is in the third person singular. So in both cases, you are addressing thou, someone who is your interlocutor, your counterpart, someone you're engaged with in conversation. But in one of the sentences, the verb remains in the second person singular, and in the other sentence, the verb changes to third person singular. It's important, as the footnote goes here, to bear in mind that these two French sentences sound the same. They're said the same way. In Italian, I know there's a similar controversy, which has not yet, I guess, been completely resolved by Treccani, or Treccani, I forget how to say it exactly, which is this encyclopedia, online encyclopedia, but has very long history, and there are all sorts of raging debates about certain grammatical particularities, which of course affect no one, but I know one of them is if you say, you are the one who will follow me, seguire, to follow, there's a question of whether that verb should be conjugated to be in the second person, segui, or third person, segue. Because what's privileged here? The one who will follow, which would be one follows, third person, or the you that follows, second person. Both phraseologies have their unique connotations. Lacan is going to return to these examples frequently throughout the lesson. And he describes the first sentence, that is the second person singular, as implying a bond of trust. That's suivra with an S. If you conjugate the verb in that form, then you are implying a bond of trust that exists between the I and you, which frame the sentence. But a different unconscious resonance is evoked by the second sentence, in which the verb to follow is in the third person singular. In this register, the relation between the I and you expresses a certainty. You better believe you're the one who's going to follow me, because one follows. If I trust you to follow, I'm going to conjugate the verb differently because I'm talking about you. You are privileged in this sentence, as opposed to the one who assumes the role of follower. Follow the channel, by the way, subscribe. The subject thou, in either case, is made to pass through what Lacan describes as a screen from the principal to relative clause. In a sentence like, one can't go for a walk in that place without someone's accosting you. This is the example he uses. The you also takes on the sense which one conveys here by centering itself on a locus of communication, which is not the concrete you, the person I'm talking to, who I can empirically apprehend in the moment, nor is it the I of this interhuman discourse, but rather, to quote Lacan, again, the locus in which is constituted the I who is speaking with him who hears. Okay. The locus itself, the place of enunciation itself, is accounted for. Or there is an attempted accounting for the place of, well, the signifier. And place is very important because the signifier has no place, but as Nancy and Labarthe say, it has no place itself and yet divides places. Think of gentlemen, ladies, the famous bathroom example. No material difference between the two facilities, but their designation introduces an essential difference which divides places. The one and the you in this genre of sentence are interchangeable, but not smoothly interchangeable. They are interchanged, but not without a loss, not without a byproduct, not without consequences. The sense these pronouns assume can only be properly apprehended if a third is presupposed. This third is the other, capital O, sometimes referred to as the big other. And to this function we owe the emergence of the subject which it obtains its imprimatur from the place within which speech finds a terminus and from which it is thought to originate. So there is a background or backdrop of speech, which is not me, not you. To put it in very frank terms, it's like, I'm not inventing my own language. You aren't inventing your own language. This language we acknowledge as coming from elsewhere, as originating from another source. And that source itself is unconsciously, although at times semi-consciously, addressed. The addresser and the addressee. The major support of intersubjective communication is ultimately ratified by the acknowledgement that speech has as its foundation a source outside of ourselves. The you, who is frequently accosted in the example Lacan produces here, refers to a number of people who are neither myself nor my interlocutor, but those who exist outside of the circuit we constitute at that moment through our exchange. But don't believe that what I'm referring to in that sentence is a concrete collectivity, that the masses, the totality of individuals who together constitute society can be assembled and enumerated such that one entity is formed. Because we're talking about a structural, propertyless reality. Okay. A formal reality. I hate to say that word reality. It's for lack of a better term that I say reality, but we're talking about a form. A form which arises purely out of a kind of necessity, a structural necessity, but which is ultimately contentless. This is why we don't have a collective unconscious. This is why we can't take recourse or find any sort of solace in the real symbolic archetypes of a Jungian variety. And Lacan is constantly at pains to evacuate content from the examples that he produces. Don't fall for the lure of these examples in thinking that the imaginary conveyance has any content to it. The content, the affective, is done away with once the structure emerges. all of the people we're describing do find themselves caught up in a discourse. A discourse is a bond. It is a social bond. None of them can claim responsibility as the founder of this discourse. Newton may be the father of modern physics, but we don't liken Newton to Joyce. Joyce invents his own idiolect, his own private language, which has some resonances with a language we recognize, but also, at least by the time we get to Finnegan's Wake, has crucially parted ways with anything we can really recognize as the English language, or any language for that matter. And however we might feel about Joyce, we allow him that license. Newton can't be like Terrence Howard here and say, look, I've just discovered something that is the truth of mathematics, which everyone has denied. He's discovering something new, but he is the vessel for it, for this new discovery. We need the scientist to do science in order to avail ourselves of discourses, but we do away with the subject, the founder of that discourse, because it is meant to be authorized by a certain first principle. That is to say, Joyce is not the founder of the discourse. The place that I was describing earlier is not a being. It has no being. The other is not a theological concept. God may be one of the guises of the other, along with the State Department, the library, all of these different garbs which the other assumes in an imaginary form, but the other is none of those things. Yes, we hear often about the other of society, the other who is the theft of enjoyment, the other who is unknown and threatening. Yes, these are imaginary others, but those are not the other that's being developed here. It has no real being, but there is a structurating potency to it. Although I'm hesitant to use that word, potency. This place is not a being. It is not to be understood as a counterpart to my own singular being, which itself would be possessed of the same faculties. It's not one who apes my movements. It's not one who imitates my speech. It's not one who affirms its identity by displaying its own capacity to make sense. The full meaning of this other, capital O, the truth which it imparts upon my words, that truth which is nothing more than a donation, does not consist in the embodiment of a potency outside of my reach, nor in any impossible noumenal cognition, rather in the presence of the statement taken as a whole, a statement in which I is contained, and I misrecognize myself. It is the formal structure of such a one, which is the other, that to which I address myself. Think of the purloined letter. Think of the notion of an address collapse all of the meanings of that word into one. There is another kind of statement, one which is neither locutory nor delocutory. That is, neither concerned with the thing speech puts into question, which would be the locutory, meaning data about the thing, a statement which conveys information about what we're looking at, an order of operations. This is how you sign into your Netflix account, do this, that, or the third. Nor delocutory, which has to do with the situation itself, the mood or state of mind of the people involved in the situation. If I say, hey, how are you today? I'm not looking for information about how you are. Maybe if I'm a therapist, then that sentence becomes locutory. If it's delocutory, then I'm acknowledging you as my counterpart. And you're going to say, live in the dream, another day in paradise. This is what's said. And it's a stock phrase, and it's a way of acknowledging the situation we're caught up in, the fact that everybody is suffering, but suffering is inevitable. The capitalist system is inevitable, and things are the way they are, and the reasons for their being that way are completely beyond my ken. And then there's the allocutive, which we'll talk about now. If I'm wrong about the locutory, delocutory, if you know more about this, if you happen to know more about this and want to correct me, do so. I'm just trying to go off of the little bit of research I've been able to do between my other duties. The allocutive is, you are my wife, you are my master. This is the kind of pronouncement which expects a response, a unique one, which attests to the change undergone by the addressee in the very act of responding. Shout out to J.L. Austin. It's language that does something. It doesn't describe an act. It doesn't represent an act. It is an act. It's one that attests to the change undergone by the addressee in the very act of responding. I already read that. In such instances, the subject thou is made to emerge in full force. The ratifying other, ontically, an authoritative body, like the church, or a legal apparatus, ontologically, the very structure of speech itself, in those moments reveals itself as an authorizing agency. I mean, the priest, the officiator of the marriage is right there before you, standing right there, and will, in a second, turn you from just another dude into a husband, a partner. So the authorizing agency here is invoked and sometimes directly personified as a person, a priest, a bureaucrat, but also an eavesdropper, as Lacan describes it, whose presence we always assume, but who we most of the time pretend is quite far away from us. But we always perform for it. Suddenly, this background is evoked not only as present, but active, as commanding. And the nature and significance of this command is ultimately indecipherable. But one thing is certain, it affects the subject, a subject who is malleable, a subject who is only as good as the last thing said about them. This full you, however, is not the same as the one in question. And while I was reading over this, I was reminded of a video I was watching last night about an influencer who live streams 24/7. And this, I don't like to use this word dystopian very often, but what could be more dystopian than that? I mean, that is a true incarnation of the all-seeing other, the affirmation of the permanence of the other as the camera lens, as the recording device. One which is always recording, which is immortalized in the function of recording and becomes the panopticon, which is not installed by the state in a carceral context, but one which we demand to imprison us such that the other is always omnipresent in a way that would fix in place an ego which is irreducible, which we can constantly affirm as the hard kernel of our being. And that's not going to work out. That's going to drive you insane, because the mystery of the other, which really isn't a mystery, there's nothing to be discovered behind the veil, but the being duped into maintaining the mystery of the other is necessary for neurotic individuation. Not so sure of the last thing I said, but it definitely raises some interesting questions. The you, which is the reflexivity of the one, elucidated here by Lacan, is always persecutory. It interpolates the subject. It holds the subject in contempt. In response to this voices, orders 1,000 other utterances are possible, but each response given is thereafter deemed not only insufficient, but deserving of the superego's scorn. Any attempt to answer the demands of the superego is met with derision. The timbre of the superego's echo always connotes mockery. The superego is a reminder/remainder of the name of the Father. The nonsense of this echo, and it isn't nonsense made up of sense-bearing parts, but rather indecipherable, faint. It's an echo of the structure itself. It's an echo of this impossible, but still necessary act in which the I hoists itself up from nothing, counts itself as one. I'm going to rephrase this a little bit later on. The superego is a remainder of the name of the Father, the name with which the Oedipalized being once hoisted itself up from nothing, gaining a foothold for its non-self as the miscounted one made material by the christening letter. If the name of the Father is a rigid designator, meaning it always designates the same thing all the time, the here and now of something permanent, eternal, then of course it could only be self-referential. The self-referentiality of the I, which before the advent of the name of the Father, before the trial of Oedipus, was the metonymic desire of the mother. That is, the desire of the mother which never settles on a single object, but is only this procession of objects with which the infant tries to identify with and keep up with the flux of an impossible desire, which itself has been Oedipalized and itself is indecipherable. That unbearable self-referentiality is given a name and therefore repressed. And then I would go so far as to say that all other words are almost like emanations of that rigid designator. Metonymy is the displacement of a name. The N-Y-M there is like name, I'm pretty sure. So it's endless displacement of the name, and metaphor is what brings it to a halt, of course. It's what arrests this process and says at the beginning and end of this sentence, stand I. Right? We'll get into that a little bit later. The superego, what does it have to do with any of that? Difficult to say. When Lacan brings up the superego, he does it in a very, what's the word, sultry manner, meaning randomly, here and there. It's almost like he is giving voice to the modality of the superego itself by bringing up the superego suddenly, at random, not so systematically. I'll leave it up to you to sort of weave the superego here back into the fabric of what we're developing. He goes on to talk about the substantive, which is another word for the noun. We can think of substance. Again, we can think of maybe not rigid designator, but something like it. It says the substantive is no less a state or process than the verbal. This is very interesting to me. We think that what we do when we construct sentences is we get a bunch of flat, stable, unmoving objects, arrange them in a certain sequence, and then we plug in the verbs to make them move. He says, no, the substantive is also temporal, and this is a callback to what he says in Seminar 1 about the name being the time of the thing. Okay? So the name itself implies a certain duration. Time itself is unfolded along the chain of signification, and the next signifier to pop up. Quilting gives us a semblance of the end of a process, but it is only a semblance. It is only the standard bearer of a underlying network, which we assume to be there and which we apprehend through metaphor. We encounter the entire network in an intuition, in a singular intuition. This leads us to a discussion of the middle voice. And this discussion of the middle voice was actually my favorite part of this lesson, because I thought it very brilliantly and very artfully captures a vanishing point that is the subject. The middle voice is in the middle of what? Well, the active and the passive. And what makes it interesting is that it's free from the identifiability of a subject who is acted upon or who acts. Such a grammatical register vivifies for Lacan the status of a subject which mustn't be conflated with the I of the name of the father, the shifter, the I which masquerades as the prime mover of a subject whose evanescence throughout the signifying chain cannot be subdued. and an I which is nowhere discoverable as anything but the signifying movement itself. The I stands for the speech act itself. The name of the Father as the shifter is the point of attraction, as Paris Levitas puts it, of all the quilting points. And then a quilting point is anti-capitan, the period, at the end of the sentence. But with the middle voice, we encounter something of a different stripe. Well, what is it? Well, in early Indo-European languages, we get something, again, a register which is not the middle voice, not the active voice, nor the passive. It's not something that happens to the subject, nor something the subject does, but something that happens within the subject. So I looked up the reference to Benveniste, the chapter he has in his book on grammar about the middle voice, and some of the examples he has. I forget which language they're from, maybe like a early form of Hindi or something. The examples are to sleep, to die. These are two things that happen within the subject if you really think about it. To be exact, we could say sleep came upon the subject, which would be passive. The subject went to sleep. That's more active, but sleep is something that happens within the subject. Death is something that happens within the subject. And I think what Lacan likes about this middle voice is that it shows how the subject is within the other, and the other is within the subject. One is the cause of the other is the cause of the one. So, right there, we bring out the subject as impossible to get in our crosshairs, but always animating and temporalizing signification, always being displaced. The middle voice also has a certain denotation of attitude, an attitude one takes to, for example, like a sacrifice. This is a dimension of the middle voice which I can't quite understand, and we would need a Hellenistic scholar to understand how, Koine Greek renders the middle voice. But what I did think about was the reflexive third person in Romance languages. I speak one Romance language, Italian, but I'm pretty sure in French, Spanish, I don't know about Romanian, that this reflexive third person is used in the same way. And it's as follows. Si mangia, si lava, si fa. One eats, one washes, one does. Translated into English, we lose a certain dimension of these forms where it's like the subject disappears. If we say one does, the subject is still too conspicuously marked by that one. Here the one is subsumed completely within the action. And of course, I don't know if French works this way, but in Italian, you don't have to say io. You don't have to say I explicitly to describe something that you're doing in the first person, because the verb itself does the work for you based on how it's conjugated. Mangio, I eat. That's it. Sometimes you might actually throw the I in there, io, for emphasis. But the subject is much more subsumed under the verbal form than in English. Si mangia would be si mangia. We're eating. It's time to eat. In one context, which would be more like allocutory. Come on, let's go eat. But in other cases, Simanja would just be eating is done, one eats, but it's equally eating is done and one eats at the same time. That's why I think it's like the middle voice. It's neither active nor passive. And that's an example of how the subject of the unconscious emerges, and what it made me think of is a child is being beaten, right? Freud's famous essay about the logic of fantasy. Freud reconstructs with three expressions a child's fantasy of what the meaning behind this act of violence might be and what it entails, what it communicates about the status of the child. Of course, the three stages of the fantasy are: a child is being beaten. Okay, passive. I am being beaten. Still passive. Someone is beating me. Passive. But, throughout it, there is this shifting of the subject position. There's a paradigm of a ternary dialectic of these moments, which induces us to question the identity of the subject of the fantasy. Who is being beaten? We're back at who, but a different who. How does the distantiation between the one doing the beating, the one beaten, and the one constrained to witness the beating indicate the nature of a fantasy of which one of the unexpected entailments is, and this is where it gets interesting, after the child identifies with the one being beaten, he affirms that he, my father, loves only me. So this is an unconscious connotation. We could say almost that the dialectic here is quilted by this affirmation of an unconscious completion of the sentence, wherein the subject is metaphorized, right? The metaphor, in a way, takes place and ends this metonymic shifting of subject positions. I could be totally wrong about that. I might just be bebopping, but it's a thought that I'm having in the moment. Perhaps an idea is being improvised. A poetics is being indulged in. What it makes me think of, and I want to talk about this more, but I'm afraid of going down a blind alley. What it makes me think of is the quilting point. And my surmise here is that the quilting point has less to do with discrete signifiers as it does with the places wherein the structure itself is quilted. Analysis is a practice which aids the analysand in the construction of punctual neologisms. And by punctual, I mean temporal, having to do with time. What I think Sam McCormick describes as kairotic time, which is not clock time, it's nonlinear time, it's the time of meaning. And punctual is in punctuation. The construction of punctual neologisms. Okay? A neologism is a made-up word. Could be a portmanteau, many different words. In the case of the word Serge Leclerc, helps to invent for his patient Porgelli, it is made up of different syllables, different phonemes, which are sourced from different images that appear in a dream he has. Unicorn, something having to do with the beach. He arranges all these images and then plucks out different syllables, condenses them into a nonsense word, Porgelli, which represents an unconscious structure. It kind of represents a failed metaphor. It represents a breakdown in meaning. It represents a jam, let's say, jammed meaning. Okay. The punctual neologism quotes those points of the structure which, as Lacan puts it, converge on their own impossibility. Paris often quotes this saying, structure converges on its own impossibility, and structure is the realist. I haven't read the seminars where he says that yet, so I'm not going to try to exegesis up anything that is beyond my grasp, but I think it'll make sense. The beauty of psychoanalysis is not that its technique, that of free association, would transport the analysand to a place beyond the imaginary symbolic. You know, people say, how do we get beyond the imaginary? How do we get beyond the symbolic? How do we, kind of like square up with the real and start throwing hands with the real? Because I'm not a pussy. I can face the real, Kitchen's not too hot for me. No, that's not how it works. You're not going to get to a place where you can suddenly confront the inarticulable real. But what analysis does is allows for an ideal of an unbridled operation, of nonlinear signifying elaboration. Okay, it's an ideal which would leave the analysand stranded at a point which manifests an aporia. Now, free association is impossible because we are not free, okay? Free association does not impart freedom upon the subject, but it is free. The signifying chain is free to make connections that do not pre-exist their utterance, that don't exist within the unconscious, waiting to be excavated, waiting to be uncovered. No. The beauty of analysis is that this temporal, this punctual moment in which something new is born, regardless of its content, is something miraculous because the moment itself is punctual. Okay? And suddenly the entire chain, which we can't say has any real being outside of analysis necessarily, although it does reveal itself in parapraxis, has no being, let's say, outside of analysis or outside of parapraxis, suddenly incarnates an entire train of ideational segments that didn't pre-exist the utterance. So, poor jelly becomes an insignia, an emblem of the passage of an unsymbolizable structure, which, despite its ineffability, nevertheless succumbs to the efficiency of the symbolizing process, which corresponds to nothing but the impossibility of the symbolic's registration of an inner fold, which corresponds to its own condition of possibility. What I mean by that is that the condition of possibility of the symbolic is the non-count, the not one. Because it cannot account for the subject, it produces an elaborated chain of meanings, which are these groupings of zeros and ones described in the recreational mathematics of the combinatory an entire logic arises organically, but only because its own point of departure cannot be honed in upon. So we're availed of an apprehension of another which is not the Buberian thou, but rather the other which is irreducible to any ontological substance, and other which installs a difference, the status of which is purely formal, not the being of my counterpart, existentially acknowledged in some sort of a Buberian way, but a structure enjoined by the action of the signifier itself. And just to go back real quick to the middle voice, Benveniste says in the active, the verbs denote a process that is accomplished outside the subject. In the middle voice, which is the diathesis to be defined by the opposition, the verb indicates a process centering in the subject. I meant to quote this earlier, the subject being inside the process. So I think that's a nice way of describing what he means by being inside death, but also death being something that occurs within the subject and not to them. Transitivity is a necessary byproduct of this conversion from middle to active. Okay. I don't think I'll try to freestyle a tangent about transitivism and transitivity there, but there might be something to it. All right, let's wrap this up. First, we need to talk about Schreber. We haven't mentioned him once. How does he figure into the dialectic of the formal other as impossible, but also a necessary byproduct of a dialectic between ego and little other? That would be an other of structure, which can only be considered from the standpoint of an always already retrospective view. Remember, Schreber is a martyr. As such, he is honest. He sacrifices himself to the unconscious laid bare. He is free to become what language chooses he become in a way. He personalizes the other, meaning the ultra meaningfulness of the doesn't allow him to fix a neurotic go along the lines of what we're going to see in schema L, right? His other, which refers everything to him. It is he who refers everything to me. That's why I'm not paranoid, he says. Is another which is a personified which is trapped in the dialectic of the transitive I and you. In some ways, the psychotic is caught in the mirror stage. And that's because only castration, which can one out that predicament. Schreber, I is exchanged for you only at the cost of his living out his symptom as if he were going to trial. The judge is the you, super egoically imposed upon the other, personifying the other. The figure of paternity omnipresent in Schreber's delusions comes to mind, and yet Schreber only talks about his father once in his memoirs, that is in passing, when he mentions a book his father had in his study, which Lacan, I believe, jokingly refers to as the Manual of Bedroom Gymnastics, medical indoor gymnastics. This is where he left in, but noting that this model of virility, the paternal figure who is able to really execute for, which would allow Schreber to be a castrated subject, as most neurotics are, and therefore affects his relationship with language, means that there is a primordial signifier that is foreclosed. Well, what does that mean? Well, this section of Seminar 3 is entitled The Environs of the Whole. And remember, it's like every one of these lessons ends, not every one, but most of them end with Lacan evoking this image of there being a primordial signifier that is foreclosed for Schreber, but also there being this whole, right? There is a whole, the fringes of which proliferate with different signifying completions to interrupted sentences. So if Schreber were to be confronted with this phrase, "Thou art the one who wilt follow me," that "wilt follow me," remember, there's a conversion here. Remember, let's go back to who and the hinge of that sentence, the screen through which the I passes to the one, where we identify with the other, but also repress the other. And we're going to look at this mapped onto schema L in a second, means that this conversion takes place automatically. I am the one being summoned here. For Schreber, instead, there is a horrifying, prodigious, hydra-headed, endless bifurcation of bifurcations that leads to all the meanings nearby being evoked, as Lacan puts it. I shall be ready. I shall be obedient. I shall be dominated. I shall be frustrated. I shall be whisked away. I shall be alienated. I shall be influenced. Think back to what we were saying about a child is being beaten. He loves only me as the resolution of the dialectic. Here we get an entire constellation of different meanings which position and reposition Schreber, but always in these examples at least, within the register of the passive, right? The wilt follow in the full sense won't be there, says Lacan. It will not be fixed in place. The signifier which gives thou its weight, of course, is the name of the Father. That is the signifier which allows the subject to metaphorize themselves in an instant and affirm themselves as the thou in question, even if it causes some fear, even if it causes anxiety. I'm thinking of that painting, that Caravaggio painting of the calling of Saint Matthew, where Christ is, I think it's Saint Matthew, extending his finger and saying, "You're the one." And he's like, "Me?" That captures thou really well. It's like you are suddenly caught in the the searchlight emanating from the helicopter, and you're like, that's interpolation, right? Interpolation's scary, but for Schreber, because he has no ego ideal, the interpolation is absolute. It's not a question of, how should I put it, responding to the call as a castrated subject, either trying to justify your existence by giving proof to your ontological guilt, as a neurotic would, but responding with your body, right? Schreber responds with his body. He responds with his biology. He responds by resexuating himself. He responds to an impossible cacophony of different interruptions, interrupted phrases with his body, with his medical indoor gymnastics. So let's, just to wrap this up, try to map the expression statement, which we began with, "Thou art the one who wilt follow me everywhere," onto our handy dandy schema L. And what a cute little matem or matheme this is. I mean, this is before we're really in the nitty gritty of Lacan's hardcore industrial black metal period of just tying knots and flinging Tauruses around and just going all G.G. Allen on those topologies. Instead, we just have this cute little hourglass. Don't we love it? Thou art the one who will follow me everywhere. Okay. Naturally, the S and O are always reciprocal. This is the access of the unconscious. And insofar as the message we receive is that of the other who founds us, the O is at the level of the thou. Thou. It's booming from the capital O, other, and it's launched. The arrow is launched in the direction of S, the subject, who answers the call, but unconsciously, the subject of the enunciation here, which is the id, or the unconscious, responds. That is to say, let's put it in very simple terms. We know that thou could be anybody. It's a space that is temporarily unoccupied, and then suddenly me, Nick, the individual, has to occupy that place. Right. But it's not me, is it? Right. Like there's this space with interpolation. It's not, I really like the way you build those bird houses. You're really good at building bird houses. And I have all these birds, but they have nowhere to shit. Can you build me a birdhouse? Because you're really good. No, it's like, there's a vagueness to this sentence that the thou reinforces. And that's why it's unconscious, right? Now, who and me, moi, this is the mirror relation, the imaginary relation. This is who, me? What, me worry? Who, me? I didn't do it. Who, me? That's right here. That's the imaginary relation. Outre, moi. I and my specular image. Now, this is also the wall of language which prevents this message from reaching its full capacity of meaning, of reaching the critical mass of significance that goes into the structure itself. And what I wanted to say before, and it's somewhat unrelated to this, but also related, is that the other, and I'm getting this from Paris, from a lecture that I listened to of his from the Seminar 16 reading group, which was, emceed by Daniel Tutt, says, there's a difference between the inconsistency of the other and the incompleteness of the other. The inconsistency of the other, and I could be wrong about this, but is tantamount to split subjectivity. Now, we want to have knowledge of the other. We believe the other knows, but it's no surprise to the vast majority of people, that the other isn't all-knowing. The other bureaucracy is not all-knowing. The parts don't meet up where they're supposed to. There's a lack of communication. Inconsistency is baked into the structure itself. How else do politicians get elected but by promising to remedy the inconsistent within the structure of government, within the organs, to make them meet up and form an organic whole? It never happens. But the inconsistency is already assumed. The inconsistency of the other isn't traumatic, but what is traumatic is the hole in the other. And we were talking about the environs of the hole. The hole in the other is traumatic, as much for the psychotic as it is for the neurotic, but the poor psychotic has to suffer this hole more like directly. That's why he's a martyr. The unconscious is laid bare. He has no unconscious. So the signifying chain, which fringes the hole in the other, is constantly and very poetically elaborated, hence the beauty of Schreber's memoirs. But you wouldn't want to have to contra what the Deleuze-Guattarians exalt, be a martyr to that unconscious and be psychotic, because to have to suffer language in that way, to me, it sounds like a nightmare. The hole in the other is the incompleteness of the other. It's the lacking cause of desire. It's the lack in the other, which is the cause of your desire, which is the cause of you. Hence the causality, which I think when it comes to object A, the object cause of desire to cause in that phrase is not discussed enough. It's very underplayed. But we're getting far afield from schema L. It's related, though, to schema L here. So, what are we talking about? For Schreber, both of these axes are collapsed into one. This is the problem. Both of these axes are collapsed into one. I mean, because his ego is fully identified with the other fully identifies his ego, and there's no impossible ideal out of reach, which is what I would say quilts and temporalizes the subject. I'm going to end this very unceremoniously. Much of what I say could have been complete bullshit, but I'm trying to learn this on my own with the help of a few very generous mentors, Daniel Tutt, my colleague Andrew, Paris Levitas, occasional correspondences with Lorenzo Chiesa. And I was thinking earlier about how it's like us Lacanians were accused of being charlatans. Lacan's a charlatan. It's that great book by Peter Matthews, I believe, is the author. Lacan the Charlatan. And it's like, I was thinking the other day, if I could make all of this up, and again, I do wild analysis myself because I haven't been studying this for years and years, but if I were able to make all of this up and just spin a yarn for absolutely nothing, then boy, I would be a free associative genius. But not being a genius, I have to at least cling to a certain conviction that I may be onto something. Or maybe not. Maybe it's all completely confabulation. But at any rate, this is what I am doing with this chapter. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to really expand on schema L as much as I wanted to, but I hope you get something from this, and we're really looking forward to reaching the end of seminar 3 and moving on to 4. I've been very conflicted when it comes to what to do with my time and whether I should skip some seminars here and there. Obviously, some haven't been officially translated into English, and I don't speak French, but we've got the Cormac Gallagher editions, which I think are serviceable from what I hear. And I don't want to skip anything. It's just that I feel like the polar ice caps might be completely melted by the time we get to 23. So we'll figure it out as we go along. But not being in the academy myself and not having to meet deadlines, not having to honor contracts, not having to please anybody or, keep up with the Joneses or outdo my peers with, my special dinosaur of a theory. I can go about this at my own pace. So I think I'll try to do all the seminars, and but I'll probably attempt to truncate it a little bit, and I'm not going to be doing a lecture on every single fucking lesson, because again, I do want to eventually reach seminar 20 and beyond. So thanks for listening. Until next time, this is Nick, signing off.